I never imagined my life would turn into the kind of story people whisper about, the kind that makes you pause and feel a pit in your stomach. I used to wake up every morning feeling grateful for the small piece of land my parents left me. It wasn't much to most people, just a quiet field surrounded by tall trees and a narrow creek running peacefully through the center. But to me, it was everything. My childhood memories were stitched into the soil, the laughter of my parents still echoing in the rustling of the leaves. Every day I walked through those fields, I felt like I was holding on to them, even though they were long gone. For years, I lived alone in the little house at the edge of the property. I planted wildflowers along the creek and built a small wooden bridge across the narrowest section, adding little wind chimes that sang softly whenever the breeze passed by. It wasn't grand or fancy, but it was mine. It was safe. It was home. Even when life became hard and lonely, I took comfort in knowing that no matter what happened out there in the world, I still had this place. Then one day everything began to change. And it happened so slowly at first that I didn't even realize what was happening. It started with a letter. A plain white envelope slipped inside my mailbox with an official-looking logo printed on the corner. It said Meadow Ridge Homeowners Association. I remembered frowning at it because I had never heard of any such association in this area. This wasn't some fancy subdivision filled with new families and cookie-cutter houses. This land had been in my family for decades, long before anyone even thought about building anything nearby. So when I opened the letter and read that they were formally notifying all residents of updated communal policies, I almost laughed. I wasn't part of any community, and no one had said anything about new policies. I ignored it, thinking it must have been sent by mistake. But the next week, another letter arrived, and the week after that, another. Each one sounded more demanding than the last, telling me I had to attend mandatory HOA meetings and warning me about violations if I did not comply. The tone was cold and harsh, and every line made me feel a little more anxious. I tried calling the number listed at the bottom of the letter, but no one ever picked up. Eventually, I stopped trying. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they would realize they had made a mistake and stop bothering me. But they didn't. Instead, people started showing up. The first time it happened, I had just stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea. A black SUV pulled up, and three men in matching polo shirts got out. They didn't say hello. They didn't smile. One of them simply asked, "Are you the owner of this property?" When I nodded, he handed me a stack of papers and said, "You're now under the governance of the Meadow Ridge HOA. This is your notice." The way he said it made my stomach twist. I tried to tell him that my property wasn't part of any development and that I never agreed to any association, but he just walked away. That night, I barely slept. I sat at the kitchen table, rereading the papers with trembling hands, trying to make sense of it all. They talked about rezoning, development plans, and required compliance with new construction guidelines. My vision blurred as I read the words approved residential expansion and 35 new housing units. The documents spoke as if my land already belonged to them, as if all of this had already been decided without me. The next morning, I stood outside and stared at the field that had always been my refuge. For the first time, it felt fragile, like something that could be taken away at any moment. Days passed, then weeks. Surveyors started arriving, walking around with their bright safety vests and clipboards, marking the ground with orange spray paint. They didn't ask for my permission. They didn't even look at me as they stepped over my flower beds and tied plastic ribbons to the trees I planted with my mother when I was a child. I tried talking to them, but they just shrugged and told me, "We're just following orders." Every night I cried in silence. I kept hoping someone would understand, that someone would see how wrong this was, but no one came. The letters kept coming, each one colder than the last. They started threatening me with fines, legal action, even eviction. I felt like I was slowly losing everything I had left. And no matter how much I begged or tried to reason with them, they just kept tightening their grip. One evening, I walked down to the creek and sat on the old wooden bridge. The wind chimes were still singing softly, but the sound felt distant, hollow. I looked at the water, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't belong there anymore, like they had already erased me from this place. I remember whispering, "Mom, Dad, what am I supposed to do?" But the only answer I got was the sound of the creek flowing quietly beneath my feet. That night, as I sat in the dark living room with the letters scattered across the coffee table, I realized something painful. They weren't going to stop. They didn't care about me, my memories, or the history of this land. To them, it was just another opportunity, another piece of property to turn into profit. It didn't matter how much it hurt me or how unfair it was. For the first time in my life, I felt truly hopeless, completely alone. The following morning, I woke to the sound of engines rumbling outside my window. At first, I thought it was a bad dream, but then I heard men shouting and trucks backing up. I pulled back the curtain and felt my heart sink so deep I could barely breathe. There were construction vehicles lined up at the edge of my land, bulldozers and cement mixers, as if they had already claimed everything as their own. Several men were already walking across the field, swinging their shovels like they belonged there. I rushed outside without thinking, still in my slippers, and shouted at them to stop. My voice cracked as I tried to explain that this was my property, that I had never agreed to any construction. One of the men didn't even look at me when he replied, "Take it up with the HOA, ma'am. We're just following the approved development plan." Another one smirked as he kicked over one of my flower pots, scattering the petals across the ground like they were nothing. I felt something inside me break. I ran back inside and grabbed every document I could find. The property deed, the old letters from my father, even an old photograph of me as a little girl standing in the field. I marched back outside and stood in front of the machines, my hands trembling as I held out the papers. "This is my land!" I cried out, my voice shaking with desperation. One of the workers finally stopped and looked at me. His face softened for a split second, and for that moment I thought maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. But then another man stepped in front of him and said, "You need to move, ma'am. We've been given legal permission. If you don't move, we'll have to call the sheriff." The sheriff, the word cut through me like a blade. For a second I felt dizzy, like the world around me was spinning out of control. I backed away slowly, my fingers still clutching the photograph of my father holding me in that same field. The machines started up again, louder and more aggressive than before. I watched helplessly as the bulldozer tore into the ground that held my childhood memories. The sound of metal digging into soil felt like a scream I couldn't drown out. By the time the sun started to set, half of my field was gone. The wildflowers were crushed, the ribbons tied around the old trees had been ripped away, and orange wooden stakes now stood where my mother once used to sit and read me stories. That night I didn't cry. I just sat in silence, staring at the dark window, while the distant glow of construction lights flickered in the distance. I felt empty, like my heart had been hollowed out. It's strange how quickly hope can disappear, how even the strongest memories can start to feel like they don't belong to you anymore. The following days were even worse. More trucks, more men, more noise. They brought in fencing and started marking the land with flags and signs that said, "Future home site, Lot 1, Lot 2, Lot 3. Each sign felt like a tombstone being planted over my past. I tried to talk to every single person I could. The site manager, the surveyors, even a few people who looked like supervisors. But no one cared. They all said the same thing. "We're just following orders." I called the county office, hoping someone there would listen, but they told me the same thing the letters had said, that the land had been rezoned and the HOA had filed the proper paperwork. I kept saying, "But I never signed anything. I never agreed." And they kept repeating that it didn't require my agreement due to jurisdiction changes, whatever that meant. One afternoon, I sat at the edge of the creek, watching the water flow quietly over the stones. For the first time in a long time, I wondered if I should just walk away. Maybe it would hurt less to leave than to stay and watch them destroy everything piece by piece. The thought made my chest tighten, and I covered my face with my hands, trying to hold back tears. "Please," I whispered to no one in particular, "please just let me keep this one thing." But the world didn't listen. That night, as I sat in the empty kitchen, I heard a knock at the door. It was loud and impatient. When I opened it, a man in a gray suit stood on my porch holding a folder. Without even greeting me, he announced that he was representing the HOA and officially notifying me that construction would continue and that I was obligated to vacate the areas now designated as common development space. I stared at him in disbelief, shaking my head. "This is my home," I said. "You can't do this. My parents left this land to me." He looked down at the folder, then back up with a cold expression that made my skin crawl. "As of last month, the land has been reassigned under HOA expansion rights. You have 30 days to comply. If you don't—" He paused, flipping to another page and tapping his finger on a line of text. "The HOA reserves the right to file for forcible removal." He handed me the folder and walked away without another word. I closed the door slowly and leaned my back against it, sliding to the floor as my legs gave out. The folder fell from my hands and landed on the floor with a soft thud. The sound echoed in the quiet house like a final verdict. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there staring at the wall, feeling the weight of everything sinking deeper and deeper. It's strange how loneliness doesn't always feel like emptiness. Sometimes it feels heavy, like something pressing down on your chest and making it hard to breathe. Eventually, I managed to pick myself up and walk into the living room. I looked around at the photographs on the wall, my parents on their wedding day, me sitting on my father's shoulders, my mother laughing in the kitchen while holding a basket of freshly picked flowers. I reached out and ran my fingers over the frame of one photo, tracing the outline of my father's smile. For a moment, I closed my eyes and pretended he was still here, that everything was still okay. But when I opened my eyes again, all I could see was the glow of construction lights outside the window. The next morning arrived with the same heavy ache in my chest. I barely slept, and the little sleep I did manage was filled with nightmares of the land being ripped apart over and over again. When I stepped outside, the early sunlight caught the fresh tire marks left in the soil, deep grooves cutting through what used to be the wildflower meadow. Everything looked bruised and injured, like it was suffering right along with me. As I walked toward the creek, I saw that they had driven stakes into the ground on both sides of it. Bright red flags fluttered in the wind like warnings that something terrible was coming. A few workers were standing near the edge, pointing across the water while holding rolled-up blueprints. I tried to call out to them, to tell them to leave the creek alone, but my voice came out weak, barely louder than a whisper. They didn't even turn to look at me. For a long time, I stood there in silence, watching them discuss their plans. I wondered if they even knew what this place meant, if they could feel even a fraction of the love and memories rooted in this ground. But their faces were blank, focused only on the job in front of them. I realized then that to them, this wasn't a home. It was just another project, another chance to build something and move on. That thought broke something inside me even more than before. I turned and walked back toward the house, my legs shaking beneath me. Inside, the walls felt smaller, like they were closing in. I sat at the old wooden table and stared out the window, feeling more helpless than I ever had in my life. It wasn't just the loss of the land, it was the feeling that I didn't matter, that everything my parents had worked so hard for could just be erased by people who didn't even take the time to understand. The days that followed passed in a blur. Every day, more pieces of the land disappeared. Trees were cut down. The wooden bridge I built with my own hands was torn apart and tossed aside like scrap. At one point, I saw them dragging away one of the wind chimes. It clanged against the metal bed of a truck as they drove away, and the sound stung more than I ever thought a simple chime could. Neighbors I had never met before started driving past slowly, looking at the construction with interest. Some of them even stopped to take pictures, as if it were something exciting. I overheard one woman say, "It's about time they developed this area. It was just empty land." Empty land. Those words kept echoing in my head. Empty. They looked at everything I loved and called it empty. One evening, while I sat by the window watching the workers leave, I felt tears sliding down my cheeks without even realizing it. I wiped them away, but they kept coming. It was a different kind of sadness now, quieter, deeper. Like a part of me had already started grieving something that wasn't completely gone yet, but would be soon. That night, I sat alone in the dark living room, holding the folder the HOA representative had given me. I opened it again, even though I already knew every word by heart. My eyes fell on the date listed for forcible removal. It was just over 3 weeks away. 23 days. The number felt unreal. How was I supposed to pack away a lifetime in 23 days? How do you say goodbye to the place that raised you? A wave of exhaustion washed over me, and I pressed my forehead against the table, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of destroying everything. But I didn't know how to fight them either. Every time I tried to stand up to them, they threw another letter, another document, another threat in my face. It felt like trying to hold back a storm with nothing but my bare hands. Later that night, I walked outside and made my way down to the creek again. The air was cold, and the moonlight reflected off the water in thin, trembling lines. I sat down on the bank and stared at the surface, listening to the gentle sound of the current. It used to comfort me. Now it made me feel like the creek was crying too. As I sat there, a memory surfaced. My father's voice, soft and calm, telling me when I was a little girl, "This land is strong, sweetheart. It's survived storms, floods, and everything in between. It's part of you, and you're part of it." I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me, clinging to it like a fragile lifeline. For a brief moment, I felt a spark of something, not hope exactly, but something close. A reminder that I wasn't helpless, that this land had survived so much before, that maybe somehow I could still protect it. But the spark faded quickly, drowned by the reality of what I was facing. I opened my eyes and looked at the creek again. The water flowed steadily, uncaring and constant. I thought about how it began further up in the hills and eventually ran into the old dam my grandfather had built decades ago to control the flow during heavy rains. No one outside my family even knew it existed anymore. It was hidden behind thick trees and overgrown brush. The HOA hadn't mentioned it in any of their documents. It wasn't part of their plans. For the first time in weeks, I felt my heart beat a little faster. Not with hope, but with something else. A quiet, cold realization. If they wanted to destroy everything anyway, if they wanted to erase my land and build their homes on top of it, maybe I had one thing left that was still mine to control. I sat there for a long time, staring at the water, letting the thoughts settle deeply in my mind. It wasn't a loud thought. It didn't come with anger or fire. It came with sadness, with a tired, heavy kind of sorrow that made the decision feel almost inevitable. Eventually, I stood up and wiped my eyes. I looked around the field one more time. The broken trees, the crushed flowers, the empty space where my bridge once stood. And then I whispered so softly that I barely heard it myself, "If they take everything from me, then they'll have to feel what it's like to lose something too." The next morning, I woke up before the sun came over the trees. For a few seconds, I lay there listening to the sing-song of early birds and pretending everything was the way it used to be. But then the dull sounds of hammers and engines began to rise in the distance and pulled me back into reality. My eyes drifted toward the window, and I saw flashing lights reflecting off the construction equipment still sitting in the field. I quietly got dressed in an old jacket and stepped out the back door with a small flashlight in my hand. The air was damp and cold, and I could feel dew collecting on the sleeves of my jacket. Every footstep I took toward the tree line felt heavier than the last. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became behind me, the noise of the construction fading slowly until I could only hear the soft crunch of leaves beneath my shoes. I hadn't gone to the old dam in years. After my grandfather died, it became harder for me to walk that far into the forest without thinking of him. He used to tell me stories about how he built it with his own hands, how it saved our land countless times from floods that would have washed everything away. I always thought of it as something strong, something protective. I never imagined I would walk toward it with the kind of sadness I carried now. The trees grew thicker as I made my way deeper into the woods. I carefully stepped over tangled roots and pushed branches aside. The flashlight flickered once, but the path was familiar enough that I kept going. Every now and then, I stopped just to breathe and steady myself, feeling my heartbeat echo in my chest. When I finally reached the clearing, I froze. There it was, the old dam, still standing just as I remembered it. Moss had grown along the stones, and the wood beams were weathered and cracked from years of rain and wind. It looked tired, like something that had been forgotten by everyone except me. I walked closer and ran my fingers over the rough surface, closing my eyes for a moment as the memories came rushing back. I opened my eyes and looked up at the sky. The morning light had started to spread across the clouds, turning everything a pale gray. My breath formed little clouds in the air as I slowly walked along the top of the dam, inspecting the old boards and bolts. My grandfather used to show me how to release the water during heavy storms by lifting a thick metal rod that ran across the structure. I knew where it was, hidden under a wooden hatch at the far end of the dam. I stood there for a long time. I could hear the water pressing against the other side, steady and powerful. All it would take was lifting that old rod and letting the current flow freely down the creek. From there, it would carry straight through the property and into the construction site. The ground was already disturbed and weak from all the digging and heavy equipment. It wouldn't stand a chance against a strong surge of water. I felt my hands trembling as I knelt down in front of the hatch. My fingers hovered over the latch, and I took a deep breath, trying to make sense of how I had gotten here. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to hurt anyone. All I ever wanted was to be left alone, to keep what was mine, to protect what my family had built. But they didn't listen. They never listened. They took and took until there was nothing left but pain. A quiet sob slipped from my throat, and I quickly covered my mouth with one hand, trying not to fall apart. My knees felt weak, and I leaned forward against the wooden hatch to steady myself. Tears slid down my cheeks and fell softly onto the cold wood below. "I'm sorry," I whispered, even though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. My grandfather, my parents, the land itself. Maybe I was apologizing to myself for having to become someone I never wanted to be. The sound of distant construction suddenly echoed faintly through the trees, cold and careless. It reminded me that time was running out, and that they were still out there, planning to erase everything I held dear. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve and took a shaky breath. Slowly, I reached down and grasped the metal latch. The cold steel bit into my palm as I pulled it up and opened the hatch. There, inside the wooden frame, was the long metal rod my grandfather had shown me so many times. It was rusted and bent, but still strong. I wrapped both hands around it and closed my eyes for a moment. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again, calm and steady, telling me to be brave. When I opened my eyes, a single tear rolled down my cheek, and I pulled the rod upward with all the strength I had left. At first, it barely moved. I strained and pulled again, my arms shaking. I could hear the wood creak beneath me. Then suddenly it gave way and snapped upward with a loud metallic groan. A deep rumble followed from the other side of the dam, like the earth itself had just awakened. I stumbled back, breathing heavily as I watched the water begin to surge through the newly opened gap in the structure. It started as a small rush, a quick flow that hissed and splashed against the stones. But within seconds it grew stronger, louder, more powerful. The force of it roared as it spilled down the creek, carrying with it leaves, branches, and anything else in its path. I watched in silence, my heart thudding painfully in my chest, as the water tore through the forest and headed toward the field. Even though I knew what I had done, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I only felt sadness, a heavy, quiet sadness that settled deep in my bones. I sank to my knees beside the dam, gripping the edge with trembling hands as tears streamed down my face. The roar of the water echoed through the trees like a mournful cry. Powerful, unbearable, unstoppable, and impossible to tame. As I knelt there, I whispered again, "I'm sorry," letting the wind carry my voice away. The sound of rushing water followed me as I slowly made my way back through the forest. Every step felt heavy, like something inside me had broken and left a hollow space behind. I didn't hurry, I couldn't. The roar echoed through the trees, rolling across the air like distant thunder, and I knew exactly where it was heading. Toward the field, toward the creek bed they had torn apart, toward everything they built without asking. By the time I stepped out of the tree line, I could already see workers running in every direction. Their voices carried across the open ground, sharp and panicked. Some of them were waving their arms, shouting orders to each other. Others were climbing up onto bulldozers and trucks, trying to move them out of the way. But the water was already there, fast and violent, crashing across the field like a furious wave. It tore through the soil, filling trenches and holes, swallowing flags and wooden stakes in seconds. I stopped and watched from a distance, clutching the old flashlight against my chest as though it were something precious. The wind blew across the field, cold and wet, and carried the sound of metal scraping against metal as the workers scrambled to escape the flood. I could hear someone shouting for help, another person yelling to shut it down, as if they could command the water to stop the way they had commanded everything else to move. But the water didn't listen to them. It kept moving, steady and unstoppable, just like it had every day on my land long before any of them arrived. Somewhere inside me, I hoped it would be enough, not to hurt them, but to make them understand, to make them stop and finally realize that this place wasn't empty, that it was a lia, that it meant something. Maybe the water could speak louder than my voice ever could. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there silently watching the flood spread across the ground, taking back every inch of land they had claimed. The homes they planned to build, the roads they marked, all of it disappeared beneath the dark, swirling water. The bright red signs floated away like discarded memories, spinning helplessly in the current. The sky began to darken with heavy clouds, and a cold drizzle started to fall. I wrapped my arms around myself and quietly turned away, walking back toward my house. The sound of the flood faded slowly as I moved farther away. By the time I reached my front porch, the only sound I could hear was the soft patter of rain on the roof. I stepped inside the house and closed the door behind me. The silence that greeted me felt different now. Not empty, not hopeless, just quiet. I walked into the living room and sat on the floor near the window, pulling my knees up to my chest. Outside, the rain continued to fall softly, blurring the edges of the world until everything looked like a distant memory. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe. My chest still ached, and my eyes were still swollen from crying, but the crushing weight I had been carrying felt just a little lighter. Maybe it wouldn't last. Maybe they would come back in a few days with more paperwork and more threats. Maybe they would try to rebuild. But in that moment, they were gone. And my land, my family's land, was still here. A soft breeze slipped through the cracked window, and I heard the faint sound of a wind chime. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. It reminded me of simpler times, of my mother's laughter, of my father's steady footsteps walking across the field, of the way the sun used to shine through the trees in the early morning. For a while, I didn't think about the HOA or the bulldozers or the letters. I just sat there with the memories and let them fill the room again. Hours passed without me moving. Outside, the rain slowly eased, leaving behind a mist that hovered over the ground like a soft blanket. I stood up and opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. The air smelled of wet earth and wildflowers, even though most of them had been crushed. Somehow their scent still lingered, refusing to disappear completely. I walked down the porch steps and stood at the edge of the flooded field. The water had begun to settle, quiet and calm now, reflecting the gray sky above. In the distance, I could see broken pieces of machinery, half submerged, like forgotten relics from a different life. The land looked wounded but not defeated. I took a deep breath and felt a tear roll down my cheek. But this time it wasn't from sorrow alone. It was something softer, a faint sense of relief mixed with pain. The kind of feeling you get when you've lost so much that every small thing you still have becomes even more precious. "I'm still here," I whispered, my voice barely louder than the breeze. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow. I didn't know if they would come back with more threats or if they would finally give up and leave this land alone. But for now, I didn't worry about any of that. I let the silence settle over me and listened to the slow, peaceful sound of water moving toward the creek again. As I turned back toward the house, I paused at the porch steps and looked up at the sky. The clouds were beginning to break apart, and a pale sliver of sunlight slipped through, falling across the field in a thin golden line. It rested on the water, making it shimmer softly like a quiet promise. I wiped my face and took another deep breath before stepping inside. I sat down by the window again, letting the fading light wrap itself around me like a warm blanket. A gentle calm filled the space, And for the first time in a long while, I closed my eyes without fear. If someone asked me how the story ends, I don't know what I would tell them. Maybe it doesn't really end. Maybe it just changes, just like the creek changes after a heavy rain. Maybe some stories aren't meant to have a clean ending. Maybe they're meant to remind us of what it means to fight for something, even when your voice feels small, even when the world refuses to listen. All I know is that right now the land is quiet again. The wind is soft, the creek is flowing, and somewhere in that gentle flow, I can almost hear my parents' voices, whispering that I did everything I could. So I sit here, holding on to the memories, hoping that tomorrow the land will still remember me too. Please subscribe.